The clock struck midnight in the sleepy hamlet of Pine Hollow, a quiet speck of a town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the late autumn breeze. Inside his weathered cabin on the outskirts, Daniel Reese sat hunched over a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim glow of a single lamp. At 55, he was a man worn by time, gray streaks in his once dark hair, lines etched deep into his face from years as a detective in Albany, and a limp from a bullet that had ended his career. Retirement hadn't suited him, the solitude he'd sought had morphed into a restless isolation, punctuated only by the clink of ice in his glass. But tonight, something shattered that stillness. Blitz, his German shepherd, erupted from his usual spot by the fireplace, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he bolted to the window, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the darkness beyond. Daniel set his glass down, the hairs on his neck prickling. Blitz wasn't a barker, never had been. In the 5 years since Daniel had adopted him from a shelter, the dog had been a steady, silent presence, his alertness honed by instincts Daniel trusted more than his own. "What's out there, boy?" he muttered, pushing himself up with a wince, his bad leg protesting. He limped to the window, peering through the grimy panes. The night was a wall of black, the moon obscured by clouds, but Blitz's growl deepened, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Then came the noise, a faint, unmistakable crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. Daniel's hand instinctively went to the drawer where he kept his old service revolver, his cop instincts flaring despite the years of rust. Blitz didn't wait. He darted to the door, scratching at it with a ferocity Daniel had never seen, his amber eyes blazing with purpose. Whatever was out there, Blitz knew it, and Daniel had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a deer or a raccoon. This was the night that would drag him back into a past he tried to bury, and Blitz was about to lead him straight to a killer. Daniel Reese hadn't chosen Pine Hollow by accident. After 25 years on the force, chasing murderers, thieves, and ghosts through Albany's gritty streets, he'd burned out. The final case, a botched raid that left his partner dead and a bullet in his femur, had been the breaking point. He'd taken early retirement at 50, sold his house, and fled to this nowhere town, a place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and the biggest crime was kids stealing apples from Old Man Carter's orchard. The cabin was a fixer-upper, its sagging porch and peeling paint a mirror to his own weariness, but it was home. He'd filled his days with small routines, chopping wood, reading dog-eared paperbacks, tinkering with a radio that rarely caught a signal. And then there was Blitz. He'd found Blitz at a shelter in Syracuse, a lean, 4-year-old German shepherd with a scar across his muzzle and a stare that cut through you. The staff said he'd been surrendered by a family who couldn't handle his intensity, too smart, too stubborn, too much dog. Daniel saw something else, a kindred spirit, a creature shaped by survival, not softness. He'd brought Blitz home that day, no questions asked, and they'd settled into a quiet partnership. Blitz didn't demand much, just food, a walk, and a spot by the fire, but he gave everything in return. He'd wake Daniel from nightmares, nudge him out of bourbon-soaked stupors, and guard the cabin like it was a fortress. Over time, Daniel realized Blitz wasn't just a pet, he was a lifeline, a tether to a world he'd nearly let slip away. That night, though, Blitz was more than a companion, he was a warning. Daniel grabbed his revolver, a .38 special he hadn't touched in months, and checked the cylinder, 6 rounds, loaded. He slipped on his boots, ignoring the ache in his leg, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a slap, the wind carrying a faint metallic tang he couldn't place. Blitz shot out, disappearing into the trees, his black form blending with the shadows. "Blitz, wait!" Daniel called, his voice rough, but the dog was gone. He cursed under his breath, grabbed a flashlight from the porch, and followed, the beam slicing through the dark as he limped into the woods. The forest was a maze of gnarled branches and uneven ground, every step a gamble with his bad leg. He moved slowly, ears straining for sound, the crack from earlier echoing in his mind. Blitz's tracks were faint in the leaf litter, but Daniel knew his dog. Blitz wouldn't stray far unless it mattered. 10 minutes in, he heard it again, a sharp snap, closer now, followed by a muffled thud. His pulse quickened, old instincts kicking in. He swung the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of Blitz ahead, standing rigid near a clearing. Daniel hobbled closer, his breath fogging in the chill, and froze. There, sprawled in the dirt, was a body, a man, face down, blood pooling beneath him, a knife glinting in the leaves nearby. Daniel's training took over. He knelt beside the body, careful not to touch, and aimed the flashlight. The man was middle-aged, maybe 40, with thinning hair and a denim jacket stained dark at the chest. A single stab wound, deep and precise, had ended him, no struggle, no defensive marks. The blood was still wet, the kill fresh, maybe an hour old. Daniel's stomach churned. This wasn't a hunting accident or a drunken brawl gone wrong, this was murder, deliberate and cold. He scanned the clearing, the beam catching broken twigs, scuffed earth, signs of a chase. Whoever did this was fast, and they were still out there. Blitz circled the body, nose low, a growl simmering in his chest. Then he stopped, head snapping up, eyes locked on a trail leading deeper into the woods. "You got something?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Blitz didn't hesitate, he took off down the trail, forcing Daniel to follow, his legs screaming with every step. The path twisted through dense pines, the air growing colder as they descended a shallow ravine. Minutes later, Blitz halted, his hackles raised, staring at a muddy patch near a stream. Daniel caught up, panting, and shone the light. There, pressed into the earth, was a footprint, too big for a hiker, too clean for an animal. Beside it, half buried in the mud, was a cigarette butt, still faintly warm. Daniel's mind raced. The killer had stopped here, maybe to catch their breath, maybe to plan. He pocketed the butt with a handkerchief, evidence, if he could get it to someone who cared. Blitz whined, nudging his hand, then darted back toward the clearing. Daniel trailed him, dread settling in his gut. When they returned, the body was still there, untouched, but Blitz's behavior shifted. He paced, nose twitching, then bolted toward the cabin, stopping at the edge of the woods to look back. "What now?" Daniel muttered, but he followed, trusting the dog's lead. Back at the cabin, Blitz didn't go inside. He stood by the porch, staring down the dirt road that wound into town. Daniel frowned, the pieces clicking. The killer hadn't fled deeper into the forest, they'd headed toward Pine Hollow. And Blitz knew it. Daniel grabbed his keys, holstered the revolver, and whistled. "Come on, boy. We're not done yet." They piled into his old Jeep, the engine coughing to life, and rolled into the night, chasing a shadow only Blitz could sense. Pine Hollow was a ghost town after dark, its single street lined with shuttered shops and a diner that closed at 9. Daniel drove slowly, windows down, the cold air sharpening his senses. Blitz sat shotgun, ears perked, eyes scanning the shadows. The murder gnawed at him, not just the act, but the location. Why his woods? Why so close to his cabin? He hadn't worn a badge in 5 years, hadn't wanted to, but this felt personal, like a taunt from a past he couldn't outrun. He stopped at the sheriff's office, a squat building with a flickering neon sign. Sheriff Linda Hayes, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, was still there, hunched over paperwork. She looked up as Daniel limped in, Blitz at his heels. "Reese," she said, arching a brow. "What brings you out this late? And with the mutt?" "Found a body," Daniel said flatly, dropping the cigarette butt on her desk. "Male, stabbed, back in my woods. Killer's fresh, maybe an hour gone." Blitz tracked this. Linda's eyes narrowed. She grabbed gloves, bagged the butt, and leaned back. "You sure it's not some hunter got unlucky?" "No accident," Daniel said. "Clean kill." Footprint headed this way. You got any strangers in town tonight? She tapped her pen, thinking. Couple of drifters at the motel, truckers, mostly. And Mark Tanner's back, been drinking at the bar all week. You know him? Daniel stiffened. Mark Tanner. His old partner from Albany, the one who'd walked away unscathed from that raid while Daniel took the bullet. They'd been close once, brothers, almost, until Mark's drinking and temper soured things. Last Daniel heard, Mark had moved south, chasing odd jobs. He's here? He asked, voice tight. Showed up 3 days ago, Linda said. Said he's visiting family, but I don't buy it. Looked rough, twitchy, like he's running from something. Blitz growled low, his head swiveling toward the door. Daniel glanced at him, then back at Linda. Check the body. I'll handle Mark. She nodded, grabbing her radio as Daniel left, Blitz shadowing him. The bar was a dive called Rusty's, a half-mile down the road. Daniel parked across the street, watching the neon glow spill onto the gravel lot. Mark's truck, a beat-up Ford he'd always driven, was there, parked crooked. Daniel's gut twisted. He didn't want to see Mark, didn't want to dredge up the past, but Blitz's reaction to the name, ears back, tail stiff, told him something was off. He stepped out, revolver tucked under his jacket, and approached the bar, Blitz at his side. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and stale beer. A handful of locals nursed drinks, their chatter dying as Daniel entered. Mark sat at the far end, hunched over a whiskey, his broad frame slouched but tense. He looked up, bloodshot eyes meeting Daniel's, and smirked. Well, damn. Danny Reese, alive and limping. What's the occasion? Daniel slid onto a stool, keeping Blitz close. Heard you're back, he said, voice even. Thought I'd say hi. Mark laughed, a harsh sound. Bullshit. You don't do social calls. What's the dog for? Therapy. Blitz growled, low and steady, his eyes locked on Mark. Daniel's hand tightened on the leash. He doesn't like you much, he said. Funny, since he's usually good with people. Mark's smirk faltered, his fingers drumming the glass. Yeah, well, dogs are dumb. What do you want, Dan? Just catching up, Daniel lied, watching Mark's hands, his twitchy movements. The man was nervous, too nervous for a casual drunk. Blitz shifted, nose twitching, and Daniel caught it, a faint whiff of something metallic, like blood, clinging to Mark's jacket. His pulse spiked, but he kept his face blank. Been in the woods lately? Mark's eyes flicked away, then back. What's it to you? Found a body out there, Daniel said, casual as if discussing the weather. Stabbed. Fresh. Thought you might have seen something. Mark froze, his glass halfway to his lips. You accusing me, partner, he snapped, voice rising. The bar went quiet, eyes turning their way. Not yet, Daniel said, leaning in. But Blitz thinks you're hiding something. And he's never wrong. Mark slammed his glass down, the crack echoing in the tense silence. You're out of your damn mind, he snarled, standing so fast his stool tipped. I don't need this crap from you or your mutt. He shoved past Daniel, storming out the door, the bell jangling behind him. Blitz lunged, barking sharp and loud, but Daniel held him back, his mind racing. Mark was rattled, too rattled for innocence. He paid the bartender with a crumpled bill and followed, Blitz pulling at the leash. Outside, Mark was at his truck, fumbling with keys. Daniel approached, flashlight in one hand, revolver loose in the other. Mark, he called, voice hard. We're not done. Mark spun, eyes wild. Stay the hell away from me, Dan, he shouted, but Blitz broke free, charging him. Mark stumbled back, cursing, and something clattered to the gravel, a hunting knife, its blade dark with dried blood. Daniel's heart stopped. He aimed the flashlight, the beam catching the glint of steel, and Mark's face went pale. "Explain that," Daniel said, stepping closer, revolver raised. Blitz circled, growling, pinning Mark against the truck. "It's not what you think," Mark stammered, hands up. I found him, okay. Guy was already dead. I panicked, took the knife." "Bullshit," Daniel cut in. "You reek of blood. Blitz smelled it the second we walked in. You stabbed that man, didn't you?" Mark's bravado crumbled, his shoulders slumping. "You don't get it," he whispered, voice breaking. "He came after me, Dan. Some drifter, owed me money from a job down south. Showed up tonight, drunk, waving a gun. I didn't mean to kill him. It just happened." Daniel stared, the weight of it sinking in. Mark, his old partner, the man he'd trusted with his life, had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Why my woods?" he asked, voice low. Mark laughed, bitter and hollow. "Thought it'd be poetic. Dump him near the great Daniel Reese, let you clean up my mess like always." Blitz snarled, lunging again, and Mark flinched. Daniel lowered the gun, but kept it ready. "You're done, Mark," he said. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Mark hesitated, then complied, his fight gone. Daniel cuffed him with a pair of old zip ties from the Jeep, Blitz standing guard. He called Linda, voice steady as he reported it, "Got your killer. Mark Tanner. Caught him red-handed." The next hours blurred, Linda's deputies arriving, Mark hauled off in cuffs, the bar buzzing with whispers. Daniel gave his statement at the station, Blitz lying at his feet, the knife bagged as evidence. The victim was identified as Carl Weeks, a small-time crook with a rap sheet from Georgia, last seen arguing with Mark at a truck stop 2 days prior. Mark's story shifted in interrogation, self-defense turned to a drunken rage, a fight over a botched deal. The truth didn't matter much to Daniel. What mattered was the betrayal, the echo of a friendship long dead. Back at the cabin, dawn broke over the hills, painting the woods in soft gold. Daniel sat on the porch, Blitz beside him, the bourbon untouched. He thought of Albany, of the raid, of Mark's laughter as they dodged bullets together. That man was gone, replaced by a stranger with blood on his hands. "You knew," he said to Blitz, scratching the dog's ears. "Before I did." Blitz rested his head on Daniel's knee, eyes calm but alert. Linda called later, confirming Mark's confession, life in prison, no parole. The cigarette butt matched his brand, the footprint his boots. Case closed. But for Daniel, it wasn't over, not really. He'd lost Mark years ago, but this sealed it, a final cut to a wound he'd ignored too long. Days turned to weeks. Pine Hollow settled back into its quiet rhythm, the murder a fading tale at Rusty's. Daniel kept to himself, but Blitz changed things. Neighbors stopped by, offering thanks or just coffee, drawn by the dog who'd sniffed out a killer. Daniel didn't mind, not as much as he'd expected. He started walking Blitz into town, letting the routine pull him back to the living. One evening, as snow dusted the hills, Daniel sat by the fire, Blitz sprawled across his feet. He thought of Carl Weeks, of Mark, of the life he'd left behind. "You're better than me, you know that," he said, voice soft. Blitz thumped his tail, a quiet agreement. Daniel smiled, the first real one in months. The past had come knocking, but Blitz had answered, and together, they'd faced it down. If this story gripped you, share it with someone who trusts their instincts. And if a dog growls at the dark, believe him, he might just know something you don't.